a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Once I retired, I discovered my coffee break was all day long. I make the most out of this time by drinking only the best coffee in the universe. Organic Man Coffee from Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson for those of you here in Laredo, or organicmancoffeetrike.shop. I'm starting a campaign to try getting at least 1 month renamed for coffee. I'm not too sure which one. Maybe October? Also, being retired, there's no such thing as a day off. Instead, I have to work really hard once in a while so I remember what it is I'm supposed to do when not working. I was watching Dan Aykroyd, unbelievable, and he was talking about a weird lake in India. The name is Rupkund Lake, but folks are now calling it Skeleton Lake. The name change took place around 1942 when the area was experiencing a bit of a drought and the water level was down. A forest ranger was out doing his job in the Himalayan mountains when he spotted some bones along the edge of a lake. Lots of bones, as if Vlad Tepes might have been here recently. Some of the bones still had flesh attached. It looked like a serial killer had been busy. This was a remote area, a 5-day walk from anywhere. Few people ever came here. It was 1,600 feet above sea level and well away from any villages or roadways. The site was too remote for an investigation at the time. It would have to wait until spring. As the weather improved, an investigation team was sent to the lake. They discovered as the snow was melting, there were more bones being exposed. There were entire skeletons. The bottom of the lake was also ripe with dead folks. Lots of bones with now un- understanding on with no understanding on where they all came from. Having a moment. The first thought was maybe there had been a battle take place near the lake. However, some of the skeletons were very small, like little kids, too young to have gone into battle, even under Vlad's standards. Vlad Tepes drafted anyone under his rule, male or female, between 12 and 70 years of age, to be soldiers in his army. Next time you buy Girl Scout cookies from a real Girl Scout and not from their parents, look at these kids and think Vlad would have had them impaling people right and left. Talk about a weird upbringing. Back at the lake. World War II was in progress and the British were running India. The officials began to suspect maybe the Japanese had mounted a sneak attack by marching through the mountains. This was a far ways from the parts of China being held by the Japanese. Somebody was desperate to put answers to this mystery. As the skeletons were being examined and it was determined many were children, the new theory was the Japanese had attacked some village and marched the inhabitants out to the middle of nowhere to kill them. This sounds like a lot of trouble just to kill these folks. Some of the skulls had damage to them, which looked as if someone had pummeled and pounded on them with a blunt weapon. This was determined to be the cause of death. Now the mystery was even deeper. There was a war on, and a bunch of dead civilians didn't amount to any kind of a tactical or strategic maneuvers, so the mystery was shelved. Any investigation would have to wait until the war was over. Once Japan was no longer trying to conquer the world, India had time to look into the dead bodies at Rupkund Lake just as soon as all the other problems were ironed out. The British thought it would ease tensions between the Hindus and the Muslims by splitting India into two separate countries. Britain was about to grant India its independence, but first they seemed to wanted to screw things up just a bit more. A line was sketched on the map, guesstimating where most Muslims lived as opposed to most of the Hindus. As if by magic, a new country was formed and everybody was going to live happily ever after. Not even close. Widespread sectarian violence left some 1 million people dead. Hindus, now finding themselves in a all Muslim country, had to flee and try to not get killed as they made their way back to India. Meanwhile, the Muslims living on the wrong side of the border were pretty much finding themselves in the same situation. India and Pakistan have settled some of the boundary issues left unresolved by the British, but strife has continued in some areas, especially the Kashmir area. Rupkund Lake is nowhere near the border, but resources needed to investigate the bodies had to be relocated to the border disputes. 1956, an anthropological survey of India in Calcutta sponsored several expeditions to the lake to see if any answers could be found. A snowstorm forced the first expedition to turn back, but 2 months later another expedition made it and returned to Calcutta with some of the remains so they could be studied. Carbon dating, still an unreliable innovation, indicated that the bones were between 5 and 800 years old. Indian scientists were intensely interested in Rupkund mystery. The lake, some thought, was a place where holy men went to commit ritual suicide by smashing themselves in the head. This would place those small kids in a whole new mystery. Now, I know there are some monasteries that do have a really young members, but it just doesn't sound like what anybody would do. Or maybe the dead were a detachment of soldiers from the 13th century army sent by the Sultan of Delhi in an ill fated attempt to invade Tibet, which still didn't explain the kids, or why the skulls were all smashed in, plus, there were no weapons found anywhere in the area. Perhaps a group of Tibet bound traders lost their way traveling from point A to point B, and they wound up dying near the lake. Still didn't add up. Perhaps this was some kind of a holy ground and an open air cemetery, or a place where victims of an epidemic were dumped to prevent contagion. If, and this is a really big if, the bodies were dropped from a wagon and landed on their heads, this might explain the damage. Sort of. It seemed to me the folks doing the investigation were stopping random folks out in the hallway and asking them to come up with possible explanations for what had been found at the lake. Just take a guess and let's see what you can think. People in the village below Rupkund had their own explanation, passed down in folk songs and stories. The villagers are on the route of a pilgrimage to honor Nanda Devi, a manifestation of Parvati, a supreme goddess in Hinduism. The pilgrimage winds up through the foothills of the Trisul Massif, where locals believe that the goddess lives with her husband Shiva. I hope I got those names right. It may be the longest and most dangerous pilgrimage in India, and particularly perilous section, the Jayumra Gali, or Path of Death, runs along a ridge high above Rupkund. I have lots of listeners in India, and well, I try my best, but I have a hard enough time speaking English. As the villagers tell it, long ago, Nanda Devi left her home to visit a distant kingdom where she was treated discourteously by the king and queen. Nanda Devi cursed the kingdom, unleashing drought and disaster and infesting their milk and rice with maggots, baby flies. In order to appease the goddess, the royal couple embarked on a pilgrimage. The king, who liked his entertainment, took along a bevy of dancing courtesans and musicians, in violation of the ascetic traditions of the pilgrimage. Nanda Devi was furious at the display of earthly pleasures, and she shoved the dancing girls down into the underworld. There are pits into which they say you can still see along the edge of the mountainside. According to the legend, she sent down a blizzard of hail and whirlwind, which swept all the pilgrims on the path of death into the lake. Their skeletons are a warning to those who would disrespect the goddess. This story is retold in a book called Mountain Goddess, a 1991 book by anthropologist William Sachs, a professor from Heidelberg University. He had been doing his undergraduate studies and he found a reference to a lake filled with bodies. He took notes, and once he was a full blown professor, he wanted to do more research on this lake. He and a fellow researcher, whom I very much want to call violins, this will become clear in a few minutes. They traveled to Wan, the closest settlement to Rupkund. They hired a local man to guide them up to the pilgrimage trail that passed the lake. The trail climbs through deep forest, emerging above the tree line. To the north is a vast wall of the Himalayan peaks. The pilgrim route follows the steep ridge lines and leads past an ancient stone shrine covered with bronze bells and tridents. There is a statue of the deity Ganesha. For those of you unfamiliar with Ganesha, he has the head of an elephant. Shiva decapitated Ganesha in a fit of rage and then replaced his top portions with an elephant head in order to bring him back to life. This was at the behest of Parvati, Ganesha's mother. Some folks go with the idea when Ganesha was born, his original head was burned to ashes by the evil eye of the god Shani, and Vishnu replaced it with an elephant's head. At 15,000 feet, the pilgrim's trail goes over a pass and up a series of switchbacks through Scree to Rupkund. The lake is about 130 feet across and 10 feet deep. As soon as Sachs and his companions arrived, they were engulfed in a blizzard. The storm seemed to come up out of nowhere. None of the locals had expected anything like it. The men hadn't even set up camp yet, so there was absolutely no shelter to be had. The folks had to stumble about in whiteout conditions on the side of a mountain and do their best to escape. Sax and violins running around the lake. That's why I wanted that name, violins. Thus the name. In whiteout conditions, you can't differentiate between the ground and the sky. A cliff looks just like the trail that you're trying to follow. The expedition was not prepared for this bad of weather. They had to turn and make haste. Run away, as King Arthur would say, trying to get back to Juan. Exhausted and feverish, the expedition barely made it back to town. Sachs and his companions spent the next 10 days recovering in the guide's home. His passion for the place was undimmed. He went on to write a doctoral thesis about the local traditions surrounding Nanda Devi. In the 80s, Sachs went on a pilgrimage by himself, went on a pilgrimage with other folks from India. He was the first Westerner, as far as anybody knew, to do such a thing. He published the book Mountain Goddess shortly thereafter. The book describes how the Himalayas, associated for thousands of years in Indian literature with famous pilgrimage places and powerful ascetic renouncers, became the setting for followers to show devotion to the goddess by giving suffering to their bodies. In 2005, Sachs was featured in a National Geographic documentary about the lake. The Indian media company that made the film assembled a team of archaeologists, anthropologists, geneticists, and technicians from research laboratories all over India and the UK to collect and study the bones. In the decades since Sachs first visited the lake, people have read his books and articles about Skeleton Lake. The lake had become a popular destination in the trekking community, and the site was being visited by lots of folks, some of whom wanted souvenirs. Others considered themselves artists, and they went about decorating the lake using the bones. The place was quickly being ruined. I was wondering, what is the difference between hiking and trekking? Hiking involves a long, energetic walk in a natural environment on hiking trails or footpaths. A trekking involves a long, vigorous hike in wild, natural environment for many days. You can trek on a hiking trail, but you can't hike on a trekking. Well, there's no trail, so therefore you can't do it. A lot of bones had been taken. Others had been rearranged in fanciful patterns or piled up in a cairn. Almost none of the skeletons were intact, and it was impossible to tell which bones belonged together or where they had originally lain. Nature had added to the confusion, churning and fracturing the bones with rock slides and avalanches. A recent landslide exposed a catch of fresh bones and artifacts. Under a slab of rocks, the team found the remains of a woman who was bent over double. The body was intact and still had skin on the bones. The scientists removed tissue samples for testing. They shot videos and they collected bones and artifacts. The team estimated that the area contained the remains of between 3 to 700 people. When does grave robbing become archaeology? I'm asking for a friend. The scientists' analysis swiftly poo pooed most of the prevailing theories. These were not the remains of a lost army. Only one weapon was ever found. The bones were both men, women, and children. There were no traces of any horses or any beasts of burden. The bones showed no evidence of battle, ritual suicide, murder, or epidemic disease. Rupkund was not a cemetery, and most of the bodies were still in place, were healthy between 18 and 35 years of age. The team's geographic analysis laid to rest the idea of traders that might have been lost in the mountains, establishing that there were no trade routes between India and Tibet ever in this area. The Tibetan border is only 35 miles north of Rupkund. The mountains form an impossible barrier. There were no trade goods found with the bodies. Artifacts retrieved included dozens of leather slippers, pieces of parasols made from bamboo and birch bark, and bangles made from seashells and glass. Devotees of Nanda Devi carry parasols and they wear bangles in the pilgrimage. The dead, it seemed, was most likely a group of pilgrims. DNA analysis showed all the victims appeared to have a genetic makeup typical of South Asia. Bone and tissue samples were sent to Oxford University for carbon dating. The new dates, far more accurate than the ones from 1956, formed a tight cluster in the 9th century. This led to the conclusion the victims had perished in a single event and had died instantaneously within hours of one another. A team of bioarchaeologists and paleopathologists noted the presence of two distinct groups. There were rugged, tall people with long heads, and also some median height, lightly built, rounded headed people who displayed a curious shallow groove across the forehead of the skull. The scientists concluded that the dead represented two distinct populations. A group of tall Brahmins from the plains of India and a company of shorter local porters whose skulls were marked by years of carrying heavy loads with a tump line looped over the forehead. Who invented that as a way of carrying anything? It's got to be bad for the neck. The investigations also revealed that three or possibly four skulls had compression fractures on the crown that had probably occurred at the time of death. It is not a weapon injury, the researchers noted, but came from a blow from a blunt, heavy, round object. This stretch of the Himalayas is notorious for hailstorms, which destroy crops and damage property. The team concluded that around the year of our Lord 800, or Anno Domini 800 AD, a bunch of pilgrims were caught out in the open during a hailstorm and everybody died. The world's biggest hailstone was 8 inches across. Not very big when looking at a handful of ice until you drop it from a few miles up. A 1 inch hailstone can fall at about 25 miles an hour. Bigger stones can be coming at you at around 100 miles an hour. Add to this, hail might be coming in massive quantities. Some of the most frequent hail occurs in mountainous areas due to the orographic lift that allows updrafts to become stronger. It is very common, and hail can be quite large in northern India and parts of China. Hailstorms can also occur frequently across most of Europe. We used to have a TV show. It was called The Eyes of Texas. The Eyes of Texas was a regional television series which aired from 1969 to 1999. The program focused on unique people, events, and places throughout the state of Texas. It was produced and syndicated by KPRC out of Houston. One episode involved a woman with a magic frying pan. It could stop a hailstorm. The crew went to see her and ask about her weird cookware. As they were interviewing the woman, a hailstorm commenced. Kind of convenient, but maybe the weather guys had given them a heads up. Today's the day you want to talk to the woman with the magic frying pan. The hail began to pound the backyard, and the woman ran and grabbed her blessed pan. She opened the back door and threw the pan into the yard, and soon after the pan hit the ground, the hail stopped. The guy doing the interview was amazed. He was speechless. He had witnessed a miracle of sorts. Then he heard the rest of the story. An average hailstorm in this particular neighborhood usually only lasted a minute or two, just long enough to grab any old fry pan and chuck it out the back door. A usual hailstorm will last about 5 minutes. Some can last as long as 15. 3 to 700 was the best guesstimate of the number of people. Let's go with 500. That's the middle. 500 people walking through the mountains get hit by a hailstorm and all wind up in the lake. If 500 people were all killed at once by frozen things falling from above, shouldn't there have been a few hundred survivors? Pilgrims would not be walking in one huge tight cluster. They would have been spread out, probably over several miles. How did the bodies all wind up in the same location? Let's see. Maybe the survivors carried the dead and the dying to the lake. I doubt it. The survivors would have taken steps, many quick steps, to get away from what looked to be cursed land. There I go, thinking again. The folks with letters behind their names all declared there was nothing weird going on. Time to go back to watching reality TV and stop asking all these questions. The legend about Nanda Devi showering pilgrims with hailstorms was based on an actual but natural event. Darn it, somebody didn't get the memo. Another group of researchers embarked on a study of the skeletons, and they came away with a far more bizarre conclusion. 16 research institutions spread out over 3 different continents looked at the skeletons and they came up with a new origination point. The bodies of quite a few, like about 100 to 200, came from the Mediterranean area. Most of these were from Crete, while others were from all over southern Europe. To add to the confusing story, the Mediterranean group died 200 or 300 years after the group from India. More research was carried out and more weird findings came to light. There weren't 2 distinct groups, but maybe 3 or more. The first one was around 1,000 years ago. Deoxyribonucleic acid. better known and easier to say, DNA. I don't want to read another article about DNA for a long time. I got sidetracked and I wound up going into way too much research and how it was done. Let's just say the boys in the white lab coats did a bunch of sciency stuff and they found out that some interesting things had been missed. The folks in charge get a bunch of students to do all the grunt work, allowing the folks in the white time to run around doing lectures, telling other folks in white lab coats how smart they are. Should one of the students find something extraordinary, said student gets a passing grade, and the white coated person publishes a paper under their own name, minus the name of the student. Grants get handed around to study the dating habits of cockroaches, and our taxes go up, while the military try to weaponize everything. Now, that's my take on how science is done today. What was found showed the skeletons from Rupkund Lake were divided into three groups. The first group were all from India. None of them were related to each other as far as they could tell, but they were traveling in a group. The research could find no reason for these folks moving together other than it being a pilgrimage. The date of death was found to be around 7 to 950 AD, about 1200 years ago. The second bunch were mostly made up of people from South Asia. Once more, no idea why they were on the mountain in India or what had killed them. They died in the early 1400s. The last group were tracked back to Greece, especially the island of Crete. What they were doing on the side of a mountain in India, nobody can even hazard a guess. The scientists think there may have been about 100 Greek citizens traveling through India when they all died suddenly on the side of a mountain in the middle of nowhere. The date of death was found to be in the 1700s. The scientists did rule out battle since no weapons were found. Disease was also taken into consideration by the DNA results. No nasty person killing bugs would have left behind telltale signs of their nastiness, so it wasn't disease that killed everyone. The folks in the white lab coats, some of them were girls, were uneasy about publishing the 18th century date, so they had a few other colleagues put their eyes on the samples. Lo and behold, the recent date held up to scrutiny. The research was published, bringing on a firestorm from the archaeologists who didn't believe the dates could be right, so therefore they weren't. Researchers began sniping at each other, saying, "Those people don't know what the heck they're doing." The almighty dollar decides what is true and what gets delivered into the round file. Institutions tend to believe what their supporters want them to believe. Anytime there's a possibility of funding being withdrawn, scientific study will be not so scientific. Evidence will turn up to support just about anything as long as it makes the folks holding the purse strings happy. The researchers with the 1700 date of death hoped other researchers would come forward to add their voices to the argument. This only brought on more nastiness from the archaeology and the history departments. When William Sachs learned of the results, he was incredulous. He had spent years in the mountain village below the lake among the devotees of Nanda Devi. The women considered themselves to be the keepers of the goddess's memory, and Sachs had recorded and translated many of their songs and stories of the pilgrimage. He feels certain that if a large party of travelers, especially foreign travelers, had died at Rupkund in recent centuries, there would have been some kind of a record in the folklore. It all sounds Greek to me. 300 years isn't all that long ago for people to have been telling stories. There should have been some survivors who staggered back home and wrote down their bizarre trip through the mountains. Add to this the idea of a group of 18th century Greeks on a Hindu pilgrimage seemed far fetched. A simpler explanation would be that the Rupkund bones somehow got mixed up while sitting in storage. It is quite possible that these bones were contaminated, Sachs said, and the researchers were simply taking their provenance on trust. Many anthropologists and archaeologists are uneasy about the incursion of genomics into their domain, and they're suspicious of its findings no matter what evidence is shown. Their thought process is archaeologists and historians own our past, and nobody is allowed to stick their noses in where they don't belong. People get uneasy when others begin talking about genetics. It brings up ideas like eugenics. Eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aimed to improve the genetic quality of human population. Historically, eugenics have attempted to alter the frequencies of various human phenotypes by inhibiting the fertility of people and groups they considered inferior, or promoting that of those considered superior. Does this sound a little bit like Nazi Germany in the 1930s? The contemporary history of eugenics began in the 19th century when a popular eugenics movement emerged in the United Kingdom and then spread to many countries, including the United States, Canada, and Australia. As these countries began taking steps to improve their populace, some folks in Europe, mostly the Germans, began to take notice. Folks with unwanted traits, such as really dark skin or mental issues, birth defects, they were being sterilized so they could no longer spread their nasty deformed genes. The Nazis got some of their ideas from the folks in the United States. Historians began to dig deeper, looking for a reason for Greek travelers to be found at Skeleton Lake. Around 500 BC, Skylax of Prianda, Greece, journeyed through parts of India and sailed down the river Indus. In his writings, Skylas called the river Indus, from which the English name for the subcontinent derives. After storming through Afghanistan and most of the Middle East, Alexander the Great invaded India in 326 BC. His armies traversed the Indus plains and reached as far as the Bias River before stopping. There was lasting Hellenic influence in the region for centuries, although the eventual decline of Greek civilization largely brought direct contact with Greece to an end. Soldiers march on their stomachs, but they also want to relax and enjoy their days off. There were ladies of negotiable affections to be found throughout the region. Birth control was iffy. There was bound to be some kids, maybe a lot of kids, brought to this world as a result of these negotiations. This could explain the skeletons in the lake showing Greek ancestry. It should have been minute. The DNA folks said the bodies were from Greece, not had Greek markers. The historians didn't want to allow this idea to answer any questions. More arguing ensued. Perhaps the Rupkund researchers thought there might be a tribe or a group in India descended from Greeks. Alexander left behind commanders and soldiers in some of the territories that he conquered, many of whom decided to stay. Members of the Kalash tribe in northern Pakistan say that they are descendants of Alexander's soldiers. The Kalash are a distinct group of people with their own language and an ancient animistic and metaphysical belief which focuses on the supernatural universe. Genetic research suggests that the Kalash have a Western European origin, and one disputed study did find Greek heritage. This was a good answer until somebody looked too close. The folks living in the Kalash area had Greek DNA, but it did not line up with the DNA found at the Skeleton Lake. Once again, the historians and the geneticists began arguing about their proof. By carefully examining the bones, the diet of the dead, that sounds like a horror movie, the diet of the folks who died at the lake could be deciphered. It turned out that the bodies from Greece had consumed food typically found in the Mediterranean area and not in the Indus Valley. The folks in white began, try that again. The folks in white, even though they disagreed on just about everything, all liked the idea of everybody at Skeleton Lake being killed by hailstones. Over 1,000-year period of time, several groups of people arrived at the lake only to be pounded to death by huge ice formations falling from above. Mushrif Tripathi. I hope I got that name right. His relatives are going to send me nasty notes. Mushrif Tripathi, who was also part of the 2019 investigation, did not agree with these findings. He looked at the skeletons, especially the ones with the skulls bashed in, and said only a few show signs of what might have been hail damage. He said that only 5 or 6 skulls looked like they'd been hit by hailstones. Stuart Fidel, a retired archaeologist, came up with a new and interesting theory. His research focused on the migration of Paleo-Americans in the New World from Asia. He said it makes zero sense that a party of male and female Greek islanders would be participating in a Hindu pilgrimage around 17 or 1800s. That's because, for one, there is no documented presence of any substantial Greek communities in northern India at that time, and two, there is no record of Europeans converting to Hinduism or Buddhism in this period. To him, the DNA evidence looked more like the dead had come from Armenia. Historically, the Armenians travel all throughout the Indus Valley, and they traded goods all over Asia and Europe. Several large Indian cities have Armenian communities that go back centuries. As for the hailstone theory, he didn't much care for that either. Fidel said that he thought the cause of death was a run-in with the Thuggees. A Thuggee, translated from Hindu as swindler or deceiver. It is related with the verb tugna, which means to deceive from Sanskrit. This term described the murder and robbery of travelers, which was popular in the northern part of Indian subcontinent, especially the northern and eastern regions of India. The English word thug is derived from the term thuggy. The thuggee operated as gangs of highwaymen who tricked and murdered their victims, usually by strangulation. To take advantage of their victims, the thugs would join travelers or pilgrims and gain their confidence, which would allow them to surprise and murder the travelers. One of the thuggee would befriend their potential targets, sometimes even going as far as converting to their religion and accompanying them on their journey to assess their potential wealth. When the time was right, one thug would distract their victims by engaging them in conversation. The other members would slip up from behind and strangle them. The killer would have a silk cord or a sash with a weight sewn into one end. Sometimes this would be a coin. The piece of cloth was swung out and around the intended victim's neck and then pulled tight. One theory on why the thuggies preferred to use strangulation was that it took advantage of a loophole in civil law which persisted from the times of the Mughal Empire. For a murderer to be sentenced to death, he or she must have shed the bloods of their victims. Those who murdered but did not shed blood might face imprisonment, hard labor, or just pay a penalty, but they would not risk execution. Another theory says that the thuggies considered themselves to be the children of Kali, having been created from her sweat. Ooh, that sounds nasty. The British ruling India generally took the view that the thuggee was a type of ritual murderer practiced by worshippers of Kali. After the murder, they sometimes mutilated the corpse to hide the evidence and buried the remains or dumped them in a lake or a river. There was no one group of thuggies. The different groups were formed in their home villages and towns, and then they moved from place to place as a group, looking for victims and staying away from the authorities. One theory says the thuggee were formed sometime around 1760. This would put them outside the timeline of two-thirds of the bodies at Skeleton Lake. Others have found evidence of the origin of the thuggee dating back to the second half of the 17th century. A general consensus among them was that they originated in Delhi. A thuggee named Ghulam Hussain was caught in early 1800s, stating that his accomplices believed that thugs had existed since the time of Alexander the Great. Another tradition among thugs who lived in the early 1800s stated that they had lived in Delhi till the time of Akbar and consisted of 7 great Muslim clans, although they all had Hindu names. After one of them killed the favorite slave of Akbar, they left Delhi for other regions to avoid being targeted by the emperor. This idea would encompass all of the skeletons. Although strangulation was their preferred method of murder, they sometimes used knives, swords, or even poison. Travel was a relatively dangerous activity. Most folks going long distances were known to carry gold or silver to pay for all the things that they were unable to bring with them. When supplies were needed, the travelers would head to a town or a village to buy what they needed. If another traveler were if other travelers were in town and heading the same direction, it was common to join up and travel together. Safety in numbers Well, at least that's what they would think. Thuggies would spot any group of strangers in town and pretend to be like minded people who just happen to be going the same direction. Let's face it, most people are not paranoid. They see the good in others, sometimes to their own detriment. Over the course of the next few days, the Thuggies would figure out who was in charge, who was possibly a fighter, who needed to be taken out first. When it was time to act, the gang would work in unison to take down everybody who might be a potential problem. The rest could be dealt with later. Each member of the caravan or pilgrimage was taken out to do away with any possible witnesses. Prior planning prevents poor performance, and the Thuggies did a lot of prior planning. Thuggies were more of a religion than a cult. About a third of them were Muslim, while the rest were Hindu or non denominational. This can be seen as odd since Muslims are monotheistic. They only believe in one God. Well, Kali is just one God. Or, seeing as the British did most of the writing about the Thuggies we are now reading, maybe a lot of their history is shrouded in what was perceived at the time. Perhaps Thuggies were more economically influenced than religious. Picture this: Sicily, 1932. Uh, no, way back in the late 900s, a group of folks had become Thuggies. They lived somewhere around Rupkund Lake, maybe 5 or 6 days' travel. As pilgrims come through town, the lookouts would check them out to see who might be financially well heeled. If there was a band of travelers on their way to pay homage to Nanda Devi, the Thuggies might have put on their traveling clothes and said, "What a coincidence! We're heading to the same place." Once at the lake, this would have seemed like a good place to camp. This may have been the predesignated place to murder everybody and steal what they could. This would explain the lack of any valuables found in or around Skeleton Lake. This could also explain some of the skulls having been bashed in. The Thuggies may have had to use extreme measures on a few folks. Time goes by, and hundreds of years later, another group of pilgrims headed to the same mountain pass through the same village or even another village not occupied now occupied by the descendants of the Thuggies. On this trip, the piles of skeletons might have given away the murder plans, or maybe it was explained away as being the cemetery. The authorities tell us the Thuggies were taken care of. They were rounded up and dealt with, or they simply ceased to be, kind of like how murder has ceased to be. The folks from the 1700s might have encountered a criminal band who used methods similar to the Thuggies, only they have far better murder techniques. I still see more questions than answers. I don't like coincidences. Life is anything but orderly. I've seen too many good folks encounter too many bad things. I've seen too many criminals get away scot free. I had to look that one up. Scot free is an old word. It's one word, too. It derives from the Old English scot free, which in Middle English became shot free. The Scot or shot in the old forms denoted a royal tax. So someone who was declared scot-free or shot-free was exempt from having to pay taxes. Life is not orderly. You walk out the door in the morning, there is a real possibility that you might not walk back in later that day. Coincidences would suggest things happen for some reason, some kind of unknown reason that things happen. At least three distinct groups of people from different parts of the planet traveled to the Himalayan mountains, spread out over 1,000-year period of time, all encountered the same form of mass destruction in the same place. Whatever killed these folks was powerful enough, nobody survived to tell what happened. This is one of those stories we may never have answers for. So many of the skeletons were removed, messed with, or even added to, the boys in the white lab coats will never get to the bottom of things. They can't even say for sure if there were 300 or 700 skeletons. They don't know what killed them, so they can't say for sure that the killing has stopped. To make matters even worse, the Indian government wants to develop the area around Skeleton Lake as a tourist attraction. Bring the kids, swim in Skeleton Lake, take back some awesome memories. More folks tramping around the area, more folks carrying off body parts. You know, the folks living nearby will want to set up food stands and sell souvenirs, T-shirts from Skeleton Lake. I want one. Maybe a plastic arm bone for the kids. People spending their hard-earned cash to see the lake are not going to want to sleep in tents, so hotels will need to be built, along with easily accessed airstrip. This leads me to wonder, what if? Whatever caused the deaths of around 500 people, all in the same small area, is something that is going to happen again, sometime soon. Kind of like all those folks keep going up to Mount Everest, only to be killed in avalanches and blizzards. Things happen. Life is not orderly. A friend of mine contacted me asking about the book I was writing with his Bigfoot encounter in it. I told him the book was out, only to realize that I hadn't finished it yet, and not even close. I got one book confused with another. I'm still looking for stories to put out for your reading pleasures. If you like nonfiction, I'm working on it. Let me say that again. That sounded bad. If you like nonfiction, I'm working on it. Any good, bad, or otherwise stories that you might have, as long as you're sure that they're true, can be a welcome addition. These can be stories your grandparents told you about their encounter with a monster, or the time your uncle was abducted by aliens, the ones from outer space. Send them to me and I'll work them into a readable paragraph or two, and I'll send you the draft so you can say yes or no. That's how it went. If you like the way I tell your story, let me know, and I'll hopefully get my next book out before 2026. If you have a story, please send it to strangethings@arkanasa.com. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.